Could you survive a road trip that took months, not hours, without Google Maps or a single roadside diner, while battling aches that felt like a permanent resident? How about if you were pushing 60, maybe even 70, in a world where 40 was considered old? Step into the dusty, dangerous world of medieval travel, roughly from 500 to 1500 AD. Number 1. The brutal reality of medieval health and aging. Traveling in the Middle Ages was not like hopping on a train or catching a flight. It was a grueling test of endurance, especially for those whose bodies were already showing the wear and tear of time. Forget about comfortable seats or climate control. The journey itself was a relentless assault on the human frame. An older traveler, perhaps a man or woman who had seen 50 or 60 summers, would have found themselves in a unique predicament. Life expectancy during this period was often far shorter than today, hovering somewhere in the late 30s or early 40s on average. But that number is heavily skewed by high infant mortality. If you made it to adulthood, living into your 50s or 60s was certainly possible, but it meant your body had survived countless challenges, famines, plagues, wars, and a lifetime of hard physical labor. The very act of living to an older age meant your body was a testament to resilience, but it also meant it was likely riddled with chronic ailments that modern medicine would easily address. Arthritis was a common scourge, twisting joints and making every step a painful ordeal. Without anti-inflammatory medications or even simple painkillers beyond herbal concoctions, an older person's knees, hips, and spine would creak in protest with every bump in the road, every climb over a fallen log, or every hour spent hunched over a saddle. The rough, uneven terrain of medieval paths, which were often little more than tracks worn by centuries of footsteps and hooves, would exacerbate these conditions. Imagine trying to navigate a steep, rocky incline when your knees constantly throb, or dismounting a horse when your back feels locked in place. The vibrations from a crude, springless cart on a bumpy track would send shockwaves through an already fragile spine, turning a simple journey into an extended torture session. Swollen, inflamed joints would make even the most basic movements, like lifting a pack or reaching for a water skin, a Herculean effort beyond joint pain. Other chronic conditions were rampant. Poor dental hygiene was the norm, meaning many older people would have suffered from tooth loss, abscesses, and constant oral pain. Eating tough, travel-friendly foods like dried meat or hard bread would have been incredibly difficult, leading to malnutrition or an inability to properly digest what little food was available. A person missing most of their teeth would struggle to chew, making a medieval traveler's limited diet even more restrictive and nutritionally deficient. Stomach ailments were also common. Without understanding of bacteria or proper sanitation, food and waterborne illnesses were a constant threat. An older digestive system, perhaps weakened by a lifetime of questionable meals, would be even more susceptible to dysentery or other debilitating illnesses that could quickly sap strength and lead to dehydration, a deadly condition on the road. Vision and hearing would also have deteriorated significantly with age, without the aid of spectacles or hearing devices. A traveler with poor eyesight would struggle to see treacherous terrain, identify landmarks, or spot potential dangers like lurking bandits or wild animals. Navigating unfamiliar territory in dim light, a common occurrence at dawn or dusk on the road, would become a truly perilous undertaking. Hearing loss would make communication difficult, especially in noisy environments like a bustling market town or a crowded inn. This could lead to misunderstandings, make it harder to glean vital information about the road ahead, or even make one vulnerable to deception. A person who could not hear an approaching horseman or the rustle of leaves indicating something hidden in the bushes would be at a distinct disadvantage. General weakness and fatigue were constant companions for the older medieval traveler. There was no concept of a balanced diet that supported sustained energy, and physical exertion was a daily reality for almost everyone. An older person, whose body had already expended much of its vital energy, would find the sheer physical demands of travel overwhelming. Walking for miles each day, enduring harsh weather conditions, and sleeping in uncomfortable exposed environments would drain their reserves quickly. Recuperation was slow and incomplete. There were no comfortable mattresses or temperature-controlled rooms waiting at the end of a long day. Sleep was often fitful, interrupted by the cold, the hard ground, or the unfamiliar noises of a medieval inn or campsite. This constant state of exhaustion would lower resistance to illness, dull mental acuity, and make every obstacle seem insurmountable. Wounds and infections were also far more serious. A simple cut or scrape, an almost inevitable occurrence on a rough journey, could quickly turn into a life-threatening infection without antibiotics or antiseptic care. An older immune system, naturally less robust than a younger one, would be even more challenged to fight off such invaders. A fever, a cough, or even a seemingly minor injury could escalate rapidly, leaving an elderly traveler incapacitated and utterly dependent on the charity of strangers or the goodwill of their companions, if they had any. Bloodletting was a common medical practice, often making matters worse by weakening an already frail person. Herbal remedies, while sometimes offering symptomatic relief, were rarely curative for serious infections or chronic diseases. A traveler would often be forced to simply endure their suffering, hoping their body could overcome the illness or succumb to it. This lack of effective medical intervention meant that any health setback on the road could quickly become a death sentence, turning a planned journey into an unexpected final resting place. Number 2. Navigating a world without roads, or good ones. The Middle Ages did not have the neatly paved, well-maintained highway systems we take for granted today. Instead, travelers, especially the elderly, faced a brutal reality of often non-existent or utterly terrible paths. When people refer to medieval roads, they often mean little more than worn tracks through fields, forests, or over hills. These tracks were created over centuries by the passage of feet, hooves, and cartwheels, with minimal or no engineering or maintenance. Imagine trying to walk for days on what amounts to a continuous uneven dirt track, often churned into mud by rain, frozen solid and treacherous with ice in winter, or dusty and deeply rutted in summer. The concept of regular road repair was almost entirely absent. The quality of these paths varied wildly. Some major routes, particularly those connecting significant towns or pilgrimage sites, might have had remnants of Roman roads, but even these were often in disrepair, overgrown, or repurposed. A Roman road, built for marching legions, might be straight and solid, but after 1,000 years of neglect, segments could be broken, flooded, or covered by debris. Most roads, however, were not Roman. They were informal routes that followed the contours of the land, taking the easiest geographical path, which often meant winding through valleys, climbing steep slopes, or traversing marshy areas. There were no standardized road signs, no mile markers to indicate distance, and no maps in the modern sense. A traveler relied on local knowledge, vague directions, or the guidance of a hired guide who might himself be prone to error or misdirection. Getting lost was a constant fret, especially for someone whose memory or physical stamina might be faltering. Weather was an unyielding master of these unkempt roads. A heavy rainstorm could quickly turn a dusty track into a quagmire of deep-sucking mud. Carts would become bogged down, and horses would struggle, making progress agonizingly slow. For an older traveler, every step in thick mud was a monumental effort, risking falls and injuries. The mud could be so deep that boots would be pulled off, leaving feet exposed to the elements and sharp objects. In winter, these muddy tracks would freeze solid, creating an impossibly uneven and icy surface. Falls were common, and a broken bone for an older person in the Middle Ages was often a death sentence due to lack of medical care and the inability to continue the journey. Snowfall could entirely obliterate paths, making navigation impossible and stranding travelers in remote areas where shelter and food were scarce. The cold itself, without modern insulated clothing, would seep into old bones, exacerbating joint pain and increasing the risk of hypothermia. Even in dry seasons, the dust kicked up by travel could be suffocating, irritating lungs and eyes, especially for someone with pre-existing respiratory issues. Bridges were rare and often rudimentary. Many rivers and streams had to be forded, meaning travelers had to wade through water, sometimes deep and fast-flowing. This was incredibly dangerous for an older person who might lose their footing in the current or suffer from the shock of cold water. Even if a bridge existed, it might be a simple wooden structure, rickety and unstable, or a stone arch that had seen better days, with crumbling masonry and missing sections. Crossing such a bridge, especially when dizzy or suffering from poor vision, would be a terrifying experience. Without proper maintenance, bridges could collapse without warning, plunging travelers into the water below. Ferries existed in some places, but they were often small, unreliable, and expensive, adding another layer of risk and cost to the journey. Terrain itself was a major obstacle. Roads often cut through dense forests, where tree roots snaked across the path and branches hung low, threatening to snag travelers. Climbing steep hills or mountains, even if the path was relatively clear, was an arduous task for anyone, but especially for an older person with limited lung capacity and aching limbs. Descending was equally perilous, with loose stones and slippery surfaces leading to dangerous falls. Marshlands and bogs were also common, where paths could disappear into treacherous, waterlogged ground, threatening to trap travelers and their animals. The lack of proper drainage meant that many areas were perpetually wet and soggy, making travel a slog. Beyond the physical challenges, the lack of infrastructure meant isolation. There were no roadside assistance services, no communication networks to call for help. If a cart broke down, if a horse went lame, or if a traveler became ill in a remote area, they were utterly on their own. Aid might be days away, if it ever came. The concept of organized public safety was minimal. This isolation magnified every challenge, turning minor inconveniences into life-threatening emergencies, especially for those whose bodies could not recover quickly or endure prolonged hardship. The road was not just a means of transport, it was a character in the drama of medieval travel, an adversary that tested every fiber of a person's being, demanding strength, resilience, and an almost superhuman tolerance for discomfort and danger. Number 3. The perilous journey. Bandits, beasts, and bad luck. Travel in the Middle Ages was not merely about enduring physical discomfort. It was a constant gamble with life and limb, a perilous undertaking where dangers lurked around every bend in the track. For an older traveler, these external threats were magnified, as their physical limitations made them less able to defend themselves, flee, or recover from misfortune. The roads, such as they were not policed, and law and order were often localized, and weak banditry was a pervasive and terrifying reality. Groups of outlaws, often desperate men driven by poverty or war, preyed on travelers in remote areas. These were not just petty thieves. They were often violent, ready to strip travelers of all their possessions, inflict injury, or even kill. For an older person, the sudden confrontation with armed brigands would have been utterly terrifying. Their diminished speed and strength meant they could not outrun an attacker, fight back effectively, or withstand a beating. They were prime targets, seen as less capable of resistance and likely to carry valuables from a lifetime of accumulation, or even just money for their journey. The loss of money meant being stranded, without means to buy food or lodging, effectively a death sentence on the road. The psychological trauma of such an encounter would be immense, let alone any physical harm suffered. Even if they escaped with their lives, the memory of such an ordeal would cast a long shadow over the remainder of their journey. Wild animals our entire life, Wild animals also posed a significant threat. Wolves, bears, and wild boars roamed the extensive forests that covered much of medieval Europe. A chance encounter, especially at dusk or during the night while camping, could be fatal. Wolves, particularly, were known to attack lone travelers or small groups. For an older person, the ability to climb a tree for safety, ward off an attack with a weapon, or simply outrun a charging animal would be severely limited. Even common farm animals, if startled or provoked, could cause serious injury. A horse kick, a bull charge, or a bite from an aggressive dog could lead to broken bones or deep wounds again, without the benefit of modern medical care. These animal encounters added another layer of unpredictable danger to every mile traversed. Beyond human and animal threats, the sheer unpredictability of travel led to countless accidents. A cart could overturn on a steep or rutted path, trapping or crushing its occupants. A horse could stumble, throwing its rider. A sudden rockfall could block a mountain pass or injure those beneath it. Crossing a swollen river could lead to drowning. For an older person, the resilience to survive such accidents was much lower. A fall that might merely bruise a younger person could shatter bones in an elderly one. The shock of being submerged in cold water or the trauma of being involved in a cart accident could easily lead to fatal complications. Even simple actions like getting on and off a horse or climbing into and out of a high-sided cart carried a risk of falls. Especially for someone with reduced balance or flexibility, getting lost was another form of peril. Without clear signage or reliable maps, deviating from the intended path even by a small margin could lead travelers into dangerous territory. This might mean wandering into a bog, an area known for bandits, or simply getting hopelessly disoriented in a dense forest. For an older person with possibly declining memory or cognitive function, recognizing familiar landmarks or retracing steps would be even harder. Being lost meant prolonged exposure to the elements, depletion of meager food and water supplies, and increasing vulnerability to all the other dangers of the wilderness. The mental strain of being lost, the fear of starvation or attack, would quickly wear down an already fragile mind. The weather itself, as mentioned, could turn perilous. Sudden storms, blizzards, or heat waves could trap travelers, causing hypothermia, heat stroke, or dehydration. Seeking shelter was not always an option in remote areas, and the rudimentary clothing of the period offered little protection against extreme temperatures. A sudden, heavy rain could cause flash floods, making river crossings deadly or washing away vital bridges. These natural phenomena, often beyond human control or prediction, could quickly turn a challenging journey into a fight for survival, a fight in which an older body had very few advantages. The accumulation of these threats, the constant possibility of human violence, animal attack, accidental injury, getting lost, or succumbing to nature's fury, made every day on the road a terrifying test of fate for medieval travelers, particularly for those whose age made them most vulnerable. Number 4. A roof over your head. Medieval hospitality and its challenges. After a long, arduous day of travel in the Middle Ages, the dream of a safe, comfortable place to rest was often just that, a dream. For an older traveler, finding suitable accommodation was a significant challenge, far removed from the predictable amenities of modern hotels. The options were generally limited to inns, monasteries, or the private homes of wealthy individuals, each presenting its own set of difficulties and discomforts. Inns, where they existed, were far from the cozy establishments we might envision. They were often noisy, crowded, and lacked basic hygiene. Picture a single large room where all guests slept together, sometimes on straw mattresses laid on the floor, or on simple hard wooden benches. Privacy was non-existent. The air would be thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale ale and wood smoke from the central hearth. For an older person accustomed to a quiet routine and perhaps needing more sleep or rest, this environment would be incredibly disruptive. The constant chatter, the snoring of other travelers, and the presence of strangers in close proximity would make restful sleep almost impossible. A lack of proper ventilation meant the air quality was poor, potentially aggravating respiratory conditions. Sanitation at inns was rudimentary at best. Toilets were often communal pits, uncleaned and foul-smelling, often located outside. Washing facilities were rare, usually limited to a communal basin and cold water. For an older person, who might have specific needs for cleanliness due to sensitive skin or incontinence, these conditions would be both uncomfortable and undignified. The risk of disease, spreading through shared facilities or from general filth, was very high. Vermin, fleas, lice, and even rats were common residents in medieval inns, making restful sleep even more challenging and adding to the general misery. Bites from these creatures could cause itching, skin infections, and transmit diseases, all of which would be particularly debilitating for an older individual with a weaker immune system. The beds themselves offered little comfort. A straw mattress, while better than the bare ground, was still hard and unsupportive, doing little to alleviate aching joints and stiff muscles. A hard wooden bed might offer no give at all. There were no soft pillows or duvets, just rough blankets. For someone suffering from arthritis, back pain, or other chronic conditions, a night spent in such a bed would offer little relief and might even worsen their discomfort, making the next day's journey even more agonizing. The cold, especially in winter, would seep into the unheated rooms, and while a central fire might provide some warmth, it would often be insufficient to keep all guests warm through the night. Beyond the physical discomforts, security was a genuine concern. Inns were places where travelers gathered, and criminals often frequented them, seeking out easy targets. An older traveler, perceived as less capable of self-defense, might be targeted for theft. Possessions had to be kept close, often even slept with, adding to the discomfort. The host of the inn might not always be trustworthy, and there was little recourse if one felt cheated or robbed. The lack of formal law enforcement meant justice was often elusive, leaving the elderly traveler vulnerable. As an alternative to inns, monasteries often offered hospitality to travelers, especially pilgrims. While generally cleaner and safer than inns, and offering a quiet refuge, they still came with their own set of challenges. Monasteries often had strict rules requiring travelers to adhere to their schedule of prayers and observances. Food would be plain and simple, sometimes meager, and might not cater to specific dietary needs of an older person. While the spiritual solace might be a comfort, the rigidity of monastic life could be taxing for someone seeking only rest. Private homes of wealthy landowners or merchants, if one was fortunate enough to secure an invitation, offered the most comfort and safety. However, such invitations were rare, reserved for those with existing connections, high social standing, or specific letters of introduction. The average elderly traveler would rarely have such an opportunity. The cost of accommodation was also a factor. Inns, though basic, still charged money, and for an older person with limited resources, every coin counted. Spending precious funds on a night of discomfort and potential danger was a constant dilemma. The lack of reliable, accessible, and comfortable accommodation meant that for the elderly traveler, the end of a day's journey was often just another difficult challenge, offering little true respite before the trials of the next day began. Number 5. Eating on the go. The quest for safe sustenance. Imagine a journey where every meal is a gamble, and finding something genuinely safe and nutritious to eat is a constant pressing concern. For elderly travelers in the Middle Ages, this was a daily reality, a daunting quest for sustenance that was often scarce, questionable in quality, and ill-suited for their particular needs. There were no prepackaged meals, no sterile grocery stores, and no health and safety regulations to ensure food quality. The diet of medieval people, especially common folk, was generally plain and seasonal. On the road, this meant a very limited selection of foods that could be carried or easily acquired. Dried meat, often salted or smoked, was a staple for travel. While portable, it was incredibly tough and difficult to chew, a significant problem for older travelers with poor dental health or missing teeth. Hard, stale bread, often made from coarse grains, was another common item. Again, this presented chewing challenges and could be difficult to digest. Fruits and vegetables were highly seasonal and perishable, making them unreliable sources of vitamins and nutrients for extended journeys. Without proper vitamin intake, conditions like scurvy were common, further weakening an already frail body. The biggest danger, however, was food and water safety. The understanding of bacteria and hygiene was non-existent. Water sources were often contaminated by human and animal waste. Drinking directly from rivers or wells without purification was common, leading to a high incidence of waterborne diseases like dysentery, cholera, and typhoid. For an older person whose immune system might be compromised and whose body had less fluid reserve, a severe bout of diarrhea or vomiting could quickly lead to fatal dehydration. The constant fear of contaminated water would force travelers to seek out safer alternatives, which were often scarce or expensive, like ale or wine, which had undergone fermentation and were therefore less likely to harbor dangerous bacteria. However, relying on alcohol for hydration presented its own problems for an elderly individual, potentially causing lightheadedness or exacerbating existing health conditions. Food preparation on the road was equally risky. If a traveler managed to acquire fresh meat, it would need to be cooked over an open fire, often without proper sanitation. Meat could be spoiled or improperly cooked, leading to food poisoning. Milk, if available, would quickly sour and become a source of illness without refrigeration. Eating at inns or roadside taverns offered little reassurance. Kitchen hygiene was poor, and ingredients might be old or low quality. Food might be bulked out with questionable additives or disguised to hide spoilage. The very methods of preservation, heavy salting, smoking, or drying, made food hard to digest and often nutritionally poorer. For an older person, specific dietary needs were completely unaddressed. Someone with a sensitive stomach, a need for softer foods, or a pre-existing condition, like gout or diabetes, though not understood as such, would find it almost impossible to maintain a healthy diet. The constant uncertainty about where the next meal would come from, and whether it would be safe or palatable, added a layer of mental and physical stress to every day of travel. Skipping meals or eating very little due to lack of appealing or digestible options was a common occurrence, leading to chronic undernourishment and a rapid decline in strength. The economic aspect of food also played a role. Food purchased on the road could be expensive, especially in remote areas or during times of scarcity. An elderly traveler on a limited budget might be forced to choose cheaper, less wholesome options, or simply go hungry. The ability to carry sufficient provisions was also constrained by one's physical capacity. An older person could not carry as much weight, limiting their ability to self-provision for long stretches. This meant a greater reliance on finding food along the way, which was not always guaranteed. The act of sourcing food, then preparing it, and finally consuming it without falling ill was a daily gauntlet for medieval travelers, but especially for those who needed the most careful and consistent nutrition to maintain their fragile health on the long road. Number 6. The clock was ticking. Limited lifespan and urgency of travel. In the Middle Ages, the concept of old age was drastically different from today. While it is true that many people did not live past their 30s or 40s due to high infant mortality and prevalent diseases, if you survived into adulthood, reaching your 50s or 60s was a significant achievement. However, once you passed 50, every year felt like a borrowed one, and the body's decline was often sharp and unyielding. For an elderly person embarking on a journey during this period, the very act of travel was often imbued with a sense of urgency, a final push, because time itself was running out. A common motivation for older travelers was pilgrimage. Many medieval people believed that a journey to a holy site like Canterbury, Rome, or Santiago de Compostela could atone for sins, earn divine favor, or even miraculously cure ailments. For someone elderly suffering from chronic pain or nearing the end of their perceived life, a pilgrimage often became a desperate last resort, a spiritual imperative to secure their soul's salvation before death. This meant undertaking an incredibly taxing journey, not for pleasure or trade, but out of profound spiritual necessity, knowing that every step might be their last. The urgency was not just about reaching the destination, it was about completing the sacred act before their mortal coil gave out. They were literally racing against the clock of their own diminishing lifespan. Another reason for late-life travel might be to visit distant family members, perhaps children or grandchildren they had not seen in years, knowing that this might be their final opportunity for a reunion. Without reliable communication, a message of illness or a desire for a last farewell would spur an arduous journey. The emotional weight of this kind of travel would be immense, pushing an individual beyond their physical limits to see loved ones one last time. There was no certainty of future opportunities. The medieval world did not offer the luxury of easy, frequent visits. A separation could truly be a permanent one, making the journey a final act of love and connection. Sometimes, an elderly person might be forced to travel due to circumstances beyond their control, fleeing war, famine, or persecution. When an army approached, when crops failed, or when religious intolerance flared, even the oldest members of a community might have no choice but to pack what little they could carry and join the exodus. In such desperate situations, their age and frailty would be a severe handicap, yet the urgency of survival would override any physical discomfort or danger. They were not traveling by choice, but by necessity, knowing that staying put meant certain death, and moving meant a chance, however slim, at survival. The pressure to keep up with younger, stronger refugees would be immense, and falling behind could mean being left to perish. The medical realities of the Middle Ages reinforced this urgency. With no real cures for many common ailments, and the body constantly battling infection and malnutrition, life was precarious. An elderly person understood that their physical reserves were finite and depleting. A minor illness or injury on the road which a younger person might shrug off could quickly become fatal. This awareness would add an extra layer of anxiety to every cough, every stumble, and every ache. The journey itself became a race against potential physical collapse, a test of how much more the body could endure before it simply gave up. There was no recovery period in a comfortable hospital. There was no long-term care. If you broke, you often stayed broken. This pervasive sense of limited time meant that medieval elderly travelers often undertook journeys with a singular focus and a deep, perhaps somber understanding of the risks. There was little expectation of comfort, only a fierce determination to achieve their objective before time ran out. Every day on the road was a testament to their willpower, pushing past pain and exhaustion, knowing that their journey was not just a physical movement from one place to another, but a final act of life, whether for spiritual solace, familial connection, or desperate survival. The clock was always ticking, and the road was an unforgiving measure of its remaining beats.